Hello, and welcome to your lecture on sexual reproduction. This is for Botany 105. As always, I'm Stephanie. Good to see you. Let's get started. Here's your list of vocabulary. This is a good time to pause the screen and copy all of these down, so you're ready to write about them when I talk about them. So you have a life cycle. I don't know if you've thought about this too much in your life, but you've got one. You are right now. You are at the this stage of your life cycle where the zebras are in this picture. You and a zebra are basically the same thing in this picture. You're both mammals, and you're both made up of almost entirely diploid cells. These diploid cells that are making up your entire body are derived from the cell division mitosis. And you either have testes or ovaries, and in your testes or ovaries, meiosis occurs. You either produce sperm or egg at some point in your life, and when a sperm and an egg fuse, it's called fertilization. And that very first cell that's formed after the fusion of a sperm and an egg is called a zygote. And at one stage in your life, you were a zygote. A zebra was also a zygote, and so was a frog and a plant cell as well. Actually, they were all zygotes. You looked like a plant cell at one stage in your life. And a zygote is the very first diploid cell. So here are some new words. Diploid and haploid, we're going to be talking about those. We're also going to be talking about meiosis, which is sort of the main story between diploid and haploid. Just wanted to start off by sort of connecting you to this story of sexual reproduction. So here's the thing about sexual and asexual reproduction. We've got these sort of two types of reproduction that are found in organisms, and there are advantages and disadvantages to both. Now, one thing I'll note now is that all prokaryotes, including bacteria and archaea, are asexual. So sexual reproduction is only found in the eukaryotes. So check out this graph here, this figure, rather. This lower curve down here represents some population of sexually reproducing organisms, okay? And they have a lot of genetic variation. That's what the x-axis is down here. So they have a lot of genetic variation because they span a wide space of this x-axis, while the asexually reproducing organisms, which are represented by this red line, this taller line, these have very little genetic variation right here compared to the sexually reproducing organisms. And when you have an environment that allows for the conditions that are in this gray box, like this gray space right here represents some environment, and the organisms that are within this gray box are the only ones that can survive. So the sexually reproducing organisms over here on the yellow, this triangle sort of over here, they will not survive because they're not within this gray box. And same with the organisms that fall into the genetic variation of the space over here. They will also not survive in this environment. So in this environment that is unchanged at this time in this picture, the asexuals have an advantage. The asexuals have a higher number of individuals as sort of represented by the higher, this higher point. But let's say the environment changes. So now our gray box, our gray area here, which represents the environment, has shifted. It has shifted outside of the genetic variation of an asexually reproducing population. And so they have all immediately gone extinct with the change of an environment. And so notice that there are still some individuals of this sexually reproducing population that are able to survive in this environment. And so this is the advantage of sexual reproduction right here. When there's a change in an environment, there's enough genetic variation in a sexually reproducing population to survive this environmental change, most likely. While in an asexually reproducing population, there's very little variation amongst individuals, and so they all went extinct with this environmental change. Okay. So just a little bit of advantages and disadvantages of asexual and sexual reproduction. Now, like I said, all prokaryotes are asexual, and the vast majority of eukaryotes are sexual, but many eukaryotes who are sexual also have an asexual phase of their life. And so here are some pictures of things that are up here. Like here's a grass. This is actually pampas grass, a pretty nasty invasive plant in this area. Anyway, they are sexually reproducing. At least some members of this genus are sexually reproducing, but they're also asexually reproducing because they form these dense rhizomatous clumps. And so what we mean by sort of, and same here with this succulent, it does produce flowers and fruits. That's sexual reproduction, which we'll talk about when we get to the flowers. But it's also producing these little tiny plantlets. These are clones, literally clones of the original sort of mother plant. And that's a version of asexual reproduction, sort of cloning. Same thing here. We have this really cool green algae, which is called Volvox, and it does both sexual and asexual reproduction. But other things that are eukaryotes, like this conidial fungi, it only undergoes asexual reproduction. And what most people think about for this one, at least, is that it had a sexually reproducing ancestor and it lost the ability to sexually reproduce over time. Interesting. Now, all of these examples of asexual reproduction in eukaryotes represent cell division, the cell division mitosis, which is we've already talked about this semester. And we're going to talk about another type of cell division. And just wanted to really quickly sort of talk about what DNA is. Again, we really briefly talked about the fact that DNA is made up of nucleotides, A's, T's, C's, and G's. And those are represented by these 4 colors here. And this is a sort of a most zoomed in version of DNA. And as we go down in this figure, we're sort of zooming out. And so DNA, it's helicoid, but then those helices are wrapped around these other sort of structures, which then form clumps. And then those clumps sort of wrap around each other. And what you can see here is that there ends up being an absolutely ridiculous amount of DNA inside of a single chromosome. And then many cells have multiple chromosomes. Most cells have multiple chromosomes. And so we've got a lot of DNA inside of cells. Okay. This version down here, this is a chromosome, and here's actually a scanning electron microscopic image of a few chromosomes here on the right. A chromosome is basically a dense clump of a bunch of DNA. Cool. That's good enough for now. Chromosomes are only present in eukaryotes. Prokaryotes, they sort of have this circular DNA instead. And here are a couple of terms that you've got to know sort of really for the rest of the semester. We're going to build on these terms a little bit, at least here and there. Genotype and phenotype. They sound very similar. They even rhyme. And they are similar terms. They go hand in hand. In fact, a phenotype is the physical expression of a genotype. So in other words, a genotype is an organism's genetic characteristics. It's all of their A's, T's, C's, and G's in different in their unique combination. All of the genes that are present in an organism's genome. That's their genotype. It's like, what are the genes that they have? Like, what are those genetic traits? That's one's genotype. Their physical traits, their physical characteristics, or maybe like behavioral, that counts as physical, or like physiological, that also counts. It's the expression of those genes that were in chromosomes. Okay. Here's another couple of quick terms, diploid and haploid, and these will make much more sense in a sec. I just wanted to define them for you right now. Diploid is a cell that has 2 copies of genes, while haploid is a cell that has 1 copy of genes. In diploid organisms like us, all of our cells have 2 copies of genes, namely 1 copy from our maternal side and another copy from our paternal side. And we call diploid 2N and haploid single N, and it sort of makes sense because diploid has 2 copies of the genes. Okay. That's where the 2 comes from. Okay. Like I said, we've talked about mitosis. Quick, sort of very, very, very quick review. Mitosis is when you've got the division of a single cell into 2 cells. And you've got a cell that starts off as diploid in this picture, and it also ends up as diploid. So to have the same number of genes at the end of a division, you have to double them during the division process. And so that's what happens during mitosis. All of the genes of which there are 2 copies, are doubled. And so for a sec, there are actually sort of 4 copies. And then those sort of split, and now you still end up with 2 copies in one cell and then 2 copies in the other cell. And then the phases of this starts with, this is just sort of the majority of their life is spent in sort of interphase. And then we've got prophase. This is when the DNA actually clumps up into those chromosomes. Metaphase, those chromosomes line up along the middle. Middle, metaphase. Anaphase, those chromosomes are sort of torn apart and they are separated. So anaphase, apart, A. And then in telophase and cytokinesis, this is when we've got new nuclei forming in respective on the respective halves of these 2 new cells, and then we've got sort of a cell wall that is forming and actually dividing this structure into 2 cells. Okay, that's mitosis. Well, that's cool. We already knew about that. Here's meiosis. Similar, very similar. Okay. And notice that at the beginning, it looks the same. In fact, we've even got things called prophase, metaphase, and anaphase, and telophase. But notice they have a little 1 after them. Well, it's because meiosis has 2 phases. And since there are 2 phases in meiosis, we end up with 4 cells at the end. So mitosis, diploid organism, 2 sets of genes in the original mother cell, and then 2 sets of genes in each of the 2 new daughter cells. Meiosis, on the other hand, mother cell, diploid. The end of meiosis, though, we have 4 daughter cells, and they each only have 1 copy of genes. Okay, so in meiosis, it's sort of, like I said, it starts off the same. We've got chromosomes. This time, the homologous chromosomes line up with one another. So the mom's copies and dad's copies essentially sort of line up with one another, and then they do sometimes they can do a fancy switchy thing called crossing over, where notice how on this one, when in anaphase, when they're getting torn apart, we've got an orange section on this red chromosome, and we've got a red section on this orange chromosome. This is another way for sexually reproducing organisms to encourage, if you will, diversity in their resulting haploid cells. We're getting to those. So the difference between meiosis and mitosis, there's a few differences here. They still line up in the middle during metaphase, but during anaphase, we've got for the first thing that happens is the 2 homologous chromosomes separate from one another. Okay, and then it's not until the second anaphase that those sister chromatids will separate from one another. Okay, so notice how anaphase 2, at least like one version, like the top or the bottom, anaphase 2 looks similar to anaphase because we've got sister chromatids being pulled apart in both anaphase of mitosis and anaphase 2 of meiosis. Okay, so this is how we end up with 4 haploid cells at the end of meiosis. Here's just another study reference for you. So this is literally the exact same thing from the previous slide, but with a little bit more information. So feel free to pause this and rewrite this in your notes. And here's what it looks like in real life. These are actual images taken under a microscope of stained cells of pollen forming in a lily. Pollen is actually, essentially a gamete. Okay, and this is another little study resource. Feel free to pause this and just kind of study meiosis a little bit. All right, back to your life cycle. Now we can make a little bit more sense of this. So meiosis will always result in haploid cells, always. And namely, it will always go from 1 diploid cell to 4 haploid cells, at least in diploid organisms. And so, in a case where the results of meiosis are either sort of male or female, we call them sperm and egg. Sperm is always a smaller gamete, and egg is the larger gamete. So a gamete, that's one of those terms that means the results of meiosis. But a gamete is something that's pretty specific. A gamete is something it's got to be haploid. Okay. And then the results of meiosis at some point will go through fertilization. Okay. Which is sort of, in a way, I'm not going to talk that much about fertilization because it's sort of, in a way, the opposite of meiosis. It's when two haploid cells come together and they make one diploid cell. Okay. So you have what's called a diplontic life cycle. Now, this is just a diagrammatic version of the exact same thing that I was just showing you. This is the same as this. Notice, I'll show you the similarities first. We've got meiosis and fertilization. The result of meiosis are 4 gametes, and the result of fertilization is a zygote. Same thing here. Meiosis, gametes, fertilization, zygote. Well, that's something that is consistent for all sexually reproducing organisms. All of them. They will all form a zygote after fertilization. And for organisms like us who have this thing called a diplontic life cycle, the zygote will undergo mitosis. So in other words, those cells of a zygote will clone themselves until you've got this big mass of cells, and then we name it and call it Stephanie Brandt or something like that, and then that's really all I am. I'm just a big cluster of cloned cells. It's fantastic. So are you. Some of my cells, some of your cells, undergo meiosis. Okay, not all of them, just a couple of them, namely the cells that are found in ovaries or testes, like I said earlier. Okay, well, we are not plants, and this is of course botany, and so let's stop talking about us now. Algae are green organisms, or red or something. They're plants, more or less, and some of them have a diplontic life cycle. Now, here are your other options for life cycles. Sometimes mitosis doesn't happen in the zygote. Sometimes it happens in the gametes. What? And so in this life cycle, which is called a haplontic life cycle, it's those haploid cells that go through mitosis. Okay? In the previous one, it was the diploid cells that went through mitosis. In haplontic life cycle, it's the haploid cells that go through mitosis, and they form these multicellular haploid individuals. And same thing, though. Like I said, all sexually reproducing organisms will form a zygote after fertilization. That's true here, too. It's just that zygote doesn't go through mitosis. It immediately goes through meiosis. Okay, so some fungi have this, also some algae. So we've got some variation in life cycles amongst algae, as you can see. There's actually one more type of life cycle, and this is sort of a combo of the two. This is called a diplohaplontic life cycle. And spoiler alert, the majority of the things that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this semester have this. Another way to say diplohaplontic life cycle is alternation of generations. And this is a fancy type of a life cycle because we've got 2 versions of a multicellular organism. One version of this individual is multicellular and haploid, and another version of this individual is multicellular and diploid. So we have mitosis occurring in the zygote and in those results of meiosis. Okay, and so now we can apply some terms to these multicellular individuals. The haploid multicellular individuals are called gametophytes, which makes sense because gametes were those haploid cells formed from meiosis, while the multicellular diploid organisms are called sporophytes. Moving on. Let's compare these 3 types of life cycles. Multicellular haploid phases are found in 2 life cycles, and multicellular diploid phases are also found in 2 life cycles. So one of these life cycles has both types of multicellular phases, both haploid and diploid. Crazy. Okay, this has all been very theoretical. Let's show you some real life examples. Here is an example. This thing is called Spirogyra. It's a member of the green algae, and it's an example of haplontic sex. So this is, remember, haplontic is when the haploid cells go through mitosis. And here are the words that you need to know. We've already talked about gametes and zygotes and gametophyte, actually. Okay. These are gametophytes. Here's a gametophyte filament, and then this is another gametophyte filament, if you will. Gametophyte implies haploid. All gametophytes are haploid. It's part of the definition of a gametophyte. Okay, well, within this haploid filament, we actually have these cells that themselves become gametes. So this whole cell literally will just sort of clump up and sort of go through this thing called a conjugation tube. One will go to the other, and as you can see, that's what's happening right here. This part, this gamete, the cell has turned into a gamete, and it is fusing with this gamete over here. In other words, we've got fertilization taking place right there in that conjugation tube. And that means only one thing. This must be the zygote. This is our first diploid cell after fertilization. Well, the zygote just goes through meiosis, and it produces these 4 myospores. And yeah, I mean, if this organism had some myospores that were very tiny and other myospores that were very large, then I could call them sperm and eggs, but it doesn't. All of the myospores are the same size, and so I just call them myospores here. But they're definitely haploid. They're the result of meiosis, and so they have to be haploid. Yeah, and then those myospores go through mitosis to form a gametophyte. And then that's your cycle. Moving on. Here's an example of a diplohaplontic life cycle. This is a very basic diagram. We're actually going to talk more about ferns next week. I'm just showing you this because this is a simplified version, and the next picture I'm about to show you is going to blow your mind. So I wanted to start with this. A fern, again, it's not an algae, even though I'm really trying to focus today's talk on algae. This is not one. This is an exception, because it's a simple version of diplohaplontic sex. Diplohaplontic is when, remember, we had both types of multicellular phases, haploid and diploid. So starting off with something you might be familiar with, a fern leaf here. We've got meiosis occurring in the sporangium. Okay, there's a zoomed in version of a tiny little dot right there. And meiosis occurs and it produces these haploid spores, okay? Well, these haploid spores go through mitosis. Haploid spores go through mitosis and produce a gametophyte. Great. And the gametophyte is producing gametes, namely sperm and eggs. The sperm and eggs go through fertilization, and they produce a zygote. The zygote also goes through mitosis, just like those myospores did. And so now we have a multicellular diploid organism, namely the sporophyte. Okay, and then that's what's going to grow up to be one of those bigger leaves. So now I'm going to show you another example of a diplohaplontic life cycle. And it's going to be much more complicated, but you're not going to need to know all of it. I'm just warning you. Whoa, crazy, I know. So, this is a member of the red algae. This is a phylum that you are going to be required to know. Rhodophyta is the name of the phylum red algae. And Polysiphonia, you actually don't need to know this name. You don't need to memorize this name. It's just an example of a genus that's found in the phylum Rhodophyta. And this is an example of diplohaplontic sex, but this one has an extra diploid stage. It's crazy. And so notice we've already gone over a lot of these terms. We've got to just introduce a couple more. Let's start here. We've got a bunch of terms on this screen that you do not need to know. So please listen on and maybe even pause this and sort of rewrite your own version of this life cycle. That'd be a good idea. These tetraspores, as they're labeled in this picture, these are myospores. Great. They're the result of meiosis. Perfect. They're haploid. That's what we'd expect. These haploid spores will develop into actually one of two different things. They're either going to form a male gametophyte or a female gametophyte. And, okay, great. We're still in haploid. Those male gametophytes are going to form sperm, and the female gametophytes are going to form eggs. Great. The egg and the sperm, they fuse in fertilization. No surprises there. One sort of difference here, though, is that the sperm fertilizes the egg, and then the egg is retained on this female gametophyte. Okay? And so since this is diplohaplontic sex, that zygote will go through mitosis. And that's what's happening here. Again, you don't need to know all these fancy words, but you do need to know some of them. Sporophyte, we already know that sporophyte is the diploid multicellular stage. Okay? Well, interestingly, this red algae has two separate diploid multicellular stages. It's got this one that's literally attached to the female gametophyte, and then that produces these diploid spores, and those diploid spores form this other type of sporophyte. So we sort of have one sporophyte, and then we have a second sporophyte. Well, it's this second sporophyte, that the second diploid stage, that's going to produce cells that go through meiosis and then sort of restart this whole process. So, okay, so here's some other terms. Gametangium and sporangium. They kind of sound similar. They have that angium at the end, and they also both sound like their respective sort of mother terms, sporophyte and gametophyte. Well, a sporangium is a structure on a sporophyte that produces spores. Cool. A gametangium is a structure on a gametophyte that produces gametes. Super cool. So here's your male gametophyte. Here, this is the male gametangium that's producing male gametes. Great. And this is your sporophyte. Well, this is the sporangium that's producing spores. Great. So you don't need to know these tetra and carpo words. Just need to know these ones. Okay. Here's another, just to tell you, a gametangium is really just a structure that's producing, it's a haploid structure that's producing gametes. Okay. So here, this is the structure, it's haploid, it's producing gametes. Great. Whoa, another crazy life cycle. Now, this is another sort of real-life example of a life cycle. This time it's the Diplontic life cycle. So remember, this is the one where the diploid stage goes through mitosis, like you. So you're sort of like a brown algae in a way, although that's definitely convergent evolution. Right? It's gotta be. Yeah. Okay, so Fucus is a genus in the phylum Phaeophyta. That's how I say that. Phaeophyta is the phylum of brown algae. And we've got a lot of the same terms. We don't have gametophyte, though, because since this is a diplontic life cycle, we don't have multicellular haploid stages here. So let's sort of start here with fertilization of a zygote. Since it's diplontic, we're going to have mitosis happening in the zygote, producing a mature sporophyte, who is diploid. Well, in Fucus, there are these little structures that house other little structures, and you're not responsible for knowing these words. But inside of these structures, so this would be a look under the microscope if we zoom in on one of these little tiny tips of this sporophyte. Inside, we've got these egg-producing structures and these sperm-producing structures. But they're on a diploid individual here, so we can't call them gametangia. No, they have specific names. The ones that the diploid structure that's producing a egg is called an oogonium, and then the diploid structure that's undergoing meiosis to produce sperm is called an antheridium. So the oogonium and the antheridium will undergo meiosis to produce egg and sperm, respectively. And then you've just got the egg stage and the sperm stage that do not undergo mitosis or anything. They just fertilize and form a zygote. That's because it's diplontic. All right, thanks for listening, and that's all I've got for you for right now. I'll see you again soon.